He crawled into a crack no wider than his shoulders. 40 feet in, the cave opened into a room the size of a cathedral. The crack had always been there. It ran vertically through the limestone face of Bone Ridge like a wound that had never healed. 3 feet tall, 18 inches wide, exhaling a cold breath that smelled of wet mineral and deep thyme. Hunters passed it. Loggers passed it. Children threw stones into it and listened to them clatter into silence. Nobody crawled in. It was too narrow, too dark, and too much like a mouth. Caleb Yancey crawled in on the 11th of November, 1848. He was 37 years old, the youngest of 4 brothers, and he had been given nothing. This was not an exaggeration or the self-pitying distortion of a man who felt he deserved more. It was a fact, recorded in the Harlan County probate records for the estate of Solomon Yancey, deceased October 1848. The family land, 260 acres of mixed timber and pasture in the Kentucky hills south of the Cumberland Gap, was divided among the 3 eldest sons. To Caleb, the youngest, Solomon left the ridge parcel, 40 acres, being that portion of rocky and unsuitable ground, lying east of the creek and south of the old survey line, together with whatever may be found thereon. Whatever may be found thereon. His brothers had laughed at that. The ridge parcel was Bone Ridge, a long, narrow spine of exposed limestone that ran for half a mile above the creek valley, too steep to farm, too rocky to timber, too barren to graze. It had been in the family for 3 generations and had never produced a single dollar of value, and their father had included it in the will, the brothers assumed, as a formality, or perhaps as a final quiet joke at the expense of the son he had never quite known what to do with. "You got the bones," said Franklin, the eldest, standing on the porch of the farmhouse that was now his. He was 46, heavy and deliberate, a man who measured the world in acres and bushels. Bone Ridge, fitting for the runt. "Ain't even good bones," added Horace, the second brother, who had received the timber rights and the sawmill. "Limestone. Can't build with it, can't burn it, can't eat it." The third brother, William, said nothing. William was the quiet one, the one closest to Caleb in temperament, if not in affection. He had received the south pasture and the livestock, and he stood in the doorway with his arms folded and his eyes on the ground, he unwilling to participate in the mockery, but equally unwilling to challenge it. Caleb took the deed and left. He had nowhere to go except the ridge, so he went there. He walked east from the farmhouse, crossed the creek on a fallen hickory log, and climbed the slope through a stand of tulip poplars whose leaves had gone the color of old gold in the November light. The ground steepened. The soil thinned. The trees gave way to cedar scrub and then to bare rock, pale gray limestone, fractured and weathered, covered in patches of lichen that were themselves the color of bone. The ridgetop was a narrow shelf, perhaps 30 feet wide at its broadest, running north to south with steep drops on either side. From the top, Caleb could see the creek valley below, the farmhouse where his brothers were dividing the last of their father's tools, and beyond that, the blue haze of the Cumberland Mountains receding into distance. He was alone. He had been alone for most of his life, in the particular way that youngest sons are alone, present in the family but peripheral to it, loved in theory but overlooked in practice. His mother had died when he was 9. His father had been a practical man who valued practical sons, and Caleb, who preferred reading to plowing and questions to answers, had never quite met the standard. He had educated himself from borrowed books and the lending library of a Presbyterian minister in the nearest town, accumulating a haphazard but genuine knowledge of natural history, geology, and the principles of scientific observation that would have been impressive in a university student and was merely eccentric in a Kentucky farmer's youngest son. And he had 40 acres of rock, $11 in coin, a bedroll, an axe, a knife, a coil of rope, a tin lantern, and a sack containing 3 books: Lyell's Principles of Geology, a used copy of Silliman's American Journal of Science, and his mother's Bible, which he kept not for devotional reasons, but because her handwriting was in the margins, and her handwriting was the closest thing to her voice that remained in the world. He made camp on the ridge that first night, in the lee of a limestone outcrop that blocked the wind. He built a small fire from cedar deadfall, ate a handful of parched corn, and sat looking at the stars, which were very bright and very far away, and utterly indifferent to the fact that Caleb Yancey owned 40 acres of nothing. In the morning, he began to walk his land. It did not take long. Bone Ridge was narrow, and 40 acres of narrow ridge covered a lot of linear distance, but very little usable area. Caleb walked the length of it in 2 hours, noting what he saw: exposed limestone in horizontal beds, heavily fractured, with occasional sinkholes where the rock had dissolved and collapsed. The vegetation was sparse: red cedar, a few stunted oaks, clumps of blue-stem grass in the shallow soil pockets. No springs, no flat ground, no timber worth cutting. His brothers had been right about one thing: the land was, by any conventional measure, useless. But Caleb was not conventional. He was observant. And what he observed, as he walked the ridge on that cold November morning, were the fractures. The limestone was full of them: vertical cracks running through the rock at irregular intervals, some hairline thin, others wide enough to insert a hand. Most were dry and empty, leading nowhere, but several of them breathed. Caleb had read about this in Lyell, the phenomenon of cave breathing, in which air moved in and out of underground passages in response to changes in barometric pressure and temperature differential. A breathing crack meant a void below. A void meant a cave. And a cave, in limestone country, could mean anything. He found the largest crack on the eastern face of the ridge, about halfway along its length. It was a vertical fissure in a small bluff face, 3 feet tall and roughly 18 inches wide, just wide enough, he judged, for a man to enter sideways if the man were not large. Caleb was not large. He was 5'7" and lean, with narrow shoulders and the kind of wiry build that his brothers had always mistaken for weakness. He knelt beside the crack and held his hand in front of it. Cold air moved outward, steady, persistent, with a force that surprised him. The temperature differential between the air inside the crack and the November air outside was significant. He estimated the exhalation at perhaps 55 degrees, warm compared to the surface air, which was in the low 40s. The smell was clean: wet stone, a faint mineral sharpness, no rot, no sulfur. Good air, moving air, air that had been somewhere and was going somewhere else. Caleb lit his lantern. He took off his coat because 18 inches was 18 inches, and he needed every fraction. He turned sideways, held the lantern in front of him with his right hand, and pushed into the crack. The first 10 feet were the worst. The limestone walls pressed against his chest and back simultaneously, and every breath required a conscious expansion of his ribs against the stone. The rock was rough, not sharp enough to cut, but abrasive, scraping his shirt and the skin beneath it with every inch of forward movement. He could not move his arms freely. He could not turn his head. He could see only what the lantern illuminated directly ahead. More crack, more stone, a narrowing that made his heart accelerate before it widened again, just barely, just enough. He moved by sliding his feet forward, then shifting his hips, then his shoulders, then his feet again. It was less like crawling and more like being swallowed, a slow, incremental consumption by stone. The cold air flowed past him, stronger now, and he followed it the way a man in a river follows the current, not trusting that it was going somewhere worth going. At 20 feet, the crack angled slightly downward. The floor dropped 6 inches, and Caleb's boots scraped on loose gravel that had accumulated in the passage over centuries. The walls were wet here, not dripping, but slick with condensation, the moisture cool against his hands when he braced himself. The lantern flame flickered in the moving air, but held. At 30 feet, the crack narrowed to what he judged was 14 inches. He stopped. His ribs were compressed. His breathing was shallow and rapid. For the first time, a spike of fear drove through the curiosity and the determination. A pure, animal terror of confinement, of being stuck, of dying in the dark between 2 walls of stone that did not care whether he lived or died. The fear was primal and enormous, and it filled the narrow space like water fills a vessel, leaving no room for anything else. He closed his eyes. He breathed. He counted 10 breaths, each one a small war against the stone that pressed his chest. And then the fear passed, or rather, he passed through it, the way a man passes through a doorway, from one room into another, from panic into a cold, clear calm that felt like the opposite of everything he had just experienced. He opened his eyes and kept moving. At 35 feet, the crack began to widen. The walls receded, first an inch, then 2, then suddenly a foot on each side, and Caleb could move his arms, could turn his shoulders, could breathe without fighting for it. The floor leveled and then dropped again, more steeply this time, a natural ramp descending into darkness. At 40 feet, the crack ended. Caleb Yancey raised his lantern and looked into a room the size of a cathedral. The chamber was immense. The lantern light, which had been sufficient to illuminate every detail of the crack, dissolved into the darkness like a candle held up to the night sky. Caleb could see the floor beneath his feet, smooth limestone, pale as milk, sloping gently downward, and the nearest wall, perhaps 20 feet to his left, rising vertically into blackness. But the far wall, the ceiling, the full dimensions of the space, these were beyond the lantern's reach. He stood in a small circle of light at the edge of something vast, and the vastness pressed against him not with the claustrophobic weight of the crack, but with its opposite, an openness so profound it was almost vertiginous. He shouted. Not a word, just a sound, a single syllable expelled from his chest. The echo came back to him 3 times, each iteration fainter and farther, arriving from directions he could not quite fix. The chamber had depth. It had height. It had distances that his lantern could not measure and his voice could only suggest. He walked forward. The floor was remarkably even, a natural pavement of water-smoothed limestone, dry and solid. His footsteps echoed with a quality he had never heard before, a resonance that was not sharp or metallic, but deep and sustained, as though the stone itself were vibrating in sympathy. The air was still and cool. He estimated 56 or 57 degrees, and carried a faint, clean smell of calcite and wet clay. After 30 paces, his lantern light reached the far wall. But it was not a wall. It was a formation, a massive curtain of flowstone, 30 feet high, cascading down from the unseen ceiling in frozen ripples of cream and amber and the palest rose. The flowstone was translucent at its thinnest edges, and the lantern light penetrated it, creating a warm glow that seemed to emanate from within the stone itself, as though the rock were lit by some internal fire. Caleb turned slowly, holding the lantern high. As his eyes adjusted and his light explored, the chamber revealed itself in fragments. Stalactites hung from above. He could see their tips now, catching the light, some slender as icicles, others thick and blunt as church pillars. The ceiling, where the stalactites emerged, was at least 40 feet overhead, possibly more. The chamber floor was dotted with stalagmites that rose from the rock in columns and cones of varying height, some barely knee-high, others taller than Caleb himself. Where stalactites and stalagmites had met, over how many thousands of years he could not fathom, they formed complete columns that ran from floor to ceiling like the pillars of the cathedral the chamber resembled. And along the walls, in every direction, the limestone had been sculpted by water into formations of staggering variety. Draperies of stone hung in folds as delicate as fabric. Rimstone dams, thin walls of calcite deposited at the edges of shallow pools, created terraced basins that held perfectly still water, clear as glass, reflecting the lantern light upward into the stalactites. In one alcove, a cluster of helictites, tiny, twisted formations that seemed to defy gravity, curling in spirals and corkscrews, covered a section of wall like frozen coral. The beauty of it was almost unbearable. Caleb was not a man given to strong emotion. His brothers would have called him cold, though the truth was that he simply kept his feelings deep, the way the earth kept its heat. But standing in the center of that chamber, in the small circle of his lantern light, surrounded by formations that had been growing in darkness for tens of thousands of years, he felt something rise in his chest that he could not name and did not try to. He sat down on a stalagmite that had been worn flat on top by some ancient flow of water and opened his notebook. His hands were shaking, not from cold, not from fear, but from the simple, overwhelming fact of what he had found. He wrote, November 12th, 1848. Entered crack on east face of Bone Ridge. Passage approximately 40 feet, very narrow. Opens into chamber of extraordinary size. Estimate 80 feet wide, 100 feet long, ceiling 40 feet or more. Formations: stalactites, stalagmites, flowstone, rimstone dams, helictites. Temperature approximately 56 degrees. Air quality good. No bats observed. Floor dry and level. He paused, then added, "This is the most remarkable thing I have ever seen." He spent the next 3 days exploring. The cathedral chamber, he could not help calling it that, though the name felt both presumptuous and insufficient, was only the beginning. From its far end, behind the great flowstone curtain, a passage descended steeply for 60 feet and opened into a second chamber, smaller than the first, but equally striking. This room was dominated by a pool, a still, clear body of water, perhaps 40 feet across and of unknown depth, fed by a slow drip from the ceiling that had been falling, drop by drop, for geological ages. The pool's edges were rimmed with calcite deposits that had built up over millennia into a natural basin of exquisite regularity, like a font in a church designed by the earth itself. Beyond the pool chamber, the cave continued. A low passage, hands and knees for 20 feet, led to a third room, this one long and narrow, like a hallway, with walls covered in a dense growth of soda straw stalactites, hollow tubes of calcite, thin as drinking straws, hanging from the ceiling in clusters so dense they looked like the inverted canopy of a crystalline forest. And the soda straws were fragile, a breath could break them. And Caleb moved through the room with a reverence that bordered on fear, terrified that his lantern flame or his clumsy human body would destroy something that had taken centuries to form. He mapped as he went. Not with instruments, he had none, but with careful estimation, pacing distances, noting compass directions by the needle of a small compass he carried, sketching chamber shapes and passage connections in his notebook. The cave system, as it revealed itself over those 3 days, proved to be extensive. At least a dozen chambers of various sizes, connected by passages that ranged from comfortable walking height to belly crawl squeezes. The total extent, Caleb estimated, was perhaps a quarter mile, though the twisting, a branching nature of the passages made precise measurement impossible. The temperature was remarkably consistent throughout, between 55 and 58 degrees in every chamber he measured, regardless of depth or distance from the entrance. This confirmed what he had read in Lyle. Below a certain depth, the earth maintained a stable temperature, insulated from the seasonal extremes of the surface. The cave was a thermal constant, warm in winter, cool in summer, and as Caleb explored deeper into the system, he began to understand, with a clarity that was almost painful in its practicality, that this was not just a wonder, it was a resource. He could live here. The thought came to him not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual recognition, the way a man recognizes a face in a crowd, first a flicker, then a certainty. And he had no house. He had no money to build one. He had 40 acres of ridgeland that could not be farmed or timbered or grazed. But beneath that land, hidden behind a crack no wider than his shoulders, was a natural shelter of extraordinary quality. Dry, warm, spacious, with good air and clean water. The cathedral chamber alone was large enough to build a home inside, with room to spare. The pool provided water. The constant temperature eliminated the need for heating fuel. He moved in on the 15th of November. He carried his bedroll, his books, his tools, and his remaining food through the crack, a laborious process that required pushing each item ahead of him through the narrow passage and then sliding after it. He set up camp in the cathedral chamber, near the base of the great flowstone curtain, where a natural alcove in the rock provided a sheltered space roughly the size of a small room. He spread his bedroll on the smooth limestone floor. He set his lantern on a flat-topped stalagmite. He opened Lyell's Geology and read for an hour by the light of his own small flame, surrounded by formations that Lyell himself would have marveled at. The darkness, when he extinguished the lantern, was absolute. Not the darkness of a cloudy night or a closed room, but the darkness of the deep earth, a blackness so total that his eyes could find no difference between open and shut. It was the same darkness that had existed in this chamber since the rock formed, since the water carved it, since the first stalactite began its infinitely slow descent from ceiling to floor. Caleb lay in it and listened to the silence, which was not quite silence. There was the faint drip from the pool chamber, the barely perceptible movement of air through the passages, and beneath everything, a deep, subsonic hum that he could feel more than hear, the vibration of the earth itself, patient and enormous. He slept soundly. The stone held him like a hand. The first winter was a trial of logistics rather than survival. The crack was the problem. Everything Caleb needed, food, fuel for his lantern, tools, materials for building, had to pass through 18 inches of limestone. He could not bring in lumber. He could not bring in a stove. He could not bring in anything wider than his own narrow shoulders, and even his shoulders required a sideways shuffle that made transporting anything beyond the most basic supplies an exercise in patience and creative geometry, and he solved it incrementally. First, he widened the crack. Not dramatically. He had no blasting powder and no desire to damage the cave's natural structure, but carefully, with a hammer and chisel, removing 6 inches of protruding rock at the narrowest point. This brought the passage from 14 inches to 20 at its tightest, which made the difference between a squeeze that left him breathless and a passage that was merely uncomfortable. The work took 2 weeks. Each chisel stroke sent a sharp crack echoing through the passage and into the cathedral beyond, and each echo reminded Caleb that he was altering something ancient, something that had existed in its precise dimensions for millennia. He removed only what was necessary. No more. Second, he established a supply system. He carried in food, lamp oil, and small tools through the widened crack, caching them in the cathedral chamber in natural alcoves that served as pantry, workshop, and storage. Larger items, planks, a small iron cookpot he purchased in town with his remaining dollars, a second lantern, he pushed ahead of him through the passage, sometimes spending an hour moving a single object 40 feet. Third, he began to build inside the cave. Not a house. The cave was his house, but the furnishings and infrastructure that transformed bare stone into a habitable space. He built a sleeping platform from cedar planks, raised a foot off the floor to keep his bedding dry. He built a desk from scavenged wood, wedging it into the alcove near the flowstone curtain, where the light from his lantern reflected most usefully off the translucent stone. He built shelves for his books and his growing collection of mineral specimens. Each piece of furniture was built inside the cave from components small enough to pass through the crack, assembled with mortise and tenon joints and wooden pegs. No nails, because nails required a forge, and a forge required ventilation that the cave's narrow entrance could not provide. The cooking problem he solved with characteristic ingenuity. He built a small fire pit near the entrance passage, at the point where the crack began to widen into the cathedral. The natural draft through the crack, that constant exhalation of cave air, carried the smoke outward and upward, creating a natural chimney that required no construction. The fire was small, fueled by cedar kindling and hardwood sticks that he brought in daily, and it provided enough heat to cook simple meals: beans, cornmeal, whatever game he could trap on the ridge above. By December, he had established a routine. Mornings were spent on the surface, checking traps, gathering firewood, making the weekly walk to the nearest settlement for supplies. The walk was 6 miles each way, and in the worst of winter, when snow blanketed the ridge and ice made the creek crossing treacherous, the journey could take most of a day. He carried what he could: flour, salt, lamp oil, the occasional luxury of coffee, and pushed it through the crack in the evening, his breath clouding in the cold air outside, while the warm exhalation of the cave met it like a greeting. The loneliness was harder to manage than the cold. There were days, particularly in January, when the light was gray and thin, and the ridge felt like the last inhabited place on earth, when Caleb sat in the cathedral chamber and felt the weight of his isolation as a physical thing pressing on his chest like the limestone had pressed during his first passage through the crack. He had no one to speak to, no one to share a meal with, no one to notice if he fell in the shaft or broke an ankle on the icy ridge or simply stopped climbing out of the cave one morning. On those days, he read. He read Lyle the way a lonely man reads letters, not just for information, but for companionship, for the sound of another mind speaking across the distance of years and miles. He read Silliman's journal and imagined the professors and students who had written its articles, imagined them in warm rooms with windows and colleagues, discussing the very formations that surrounded him in darkness. He read his mother's Bible and traced her handwriting with his finger, the faded ink a thread connecting him to a woman who had died when he was too young to understand what he was losing. And he worked. Work was the antidote. As long as his hands were moving, building, carving, measuring, writing, the loneliness receded to a manageable distance, like a sound that was always present, but could be ignored if you concentrated on something closer. He learned in that first winter that purpose was a stronger medicine than rest, and that the cave, with its endless formations and passages and mysteries, provided more purpose than he could exhaust in a lifetime. Afternoons and evenings were spent underground in the constant 56-degree warmth, working on his living space, exploring new passages, and recording his observations in his notebook. The notebook was becoming something more than a diary. It was becoming a systematic survey of the cave, a detailed record of every chamber, every passage, every formation, with measurements, sketches, and geological observations that reflected Caleb's growing understanding of the processes that had created this underground world. He documented the cave's hydrology, tracing the path of water from the drip in the pool chamber through a series of natural channels to what he believed was a spring emerging on the south face of the ridge. He documented the formations, identifying calcite, aragonite, and what he suspected was gypsum in the soda straw room. He documented the temperature variations, minimal but measurable, between chambers, and the patterns of air movement that shifted subtly with changes in the weather above. He was not a trained geologist. He was a farmer's son with borrowed books and an unschooled gift for observation. But the observations were precise, and the records were meticulous, and the cave, as it emerged in his notebook, was a place of far greater complexity and significance than any casual visitor could have guessed. Word reached the settlement, as word always did. A trapper named Olin Fouch, following a deer trail along Bone Ridge in January, noticed smoke rising from a crack in the rock. He investigated and found, to his considerable alarm, a man's coat and a coil of rope lying at the entrance to what appeared to be a fissure in the earth. He called out. After a moment, a voice answered from inside the rock. "Who's there?" said the voice. "Olin Fouch." "Who the hell are you?" "Caleb Yancey. I live here." There was a pause. "In the rock?" "In the cave behind the rock. Come in if you'd like." Fouch did not go in. He went to town and told everyone he met that Solomon Yancey's youngest boy had gone mad and was living inside Bone Ridge like a snake in a crevice. The story spread rapidly, acquiring embellishments with each retelling. By the time it reached Caleb's brothers, the version they heard was that Caleb had been driven insane by grief over their father's death and was sleeping in a hole in the ground, eating raw meat and talking to himself. Franklin rode out to the ridge on a cold February morning, not from concern, but from a sense of proprietary embarrassment. A Yancey living in a crack in the rock reflected poorly on the family, and Franklin, as the eldest, felt the obligation to address it. He found Caleb at the entrance to the crack, splitting kindling. "You need to come down from here," Franklin said, not dismounting. "Why?" "Because you're living in a hole. I'm living in a cave. There's a difference. People are talking. People always talk. It doesn't require my participation." Franklin's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to resistance from Caleb, who had spent his entire life being compliant and invisible. "Pa didn't leave you this land so you could crawl into it like a groundhog." "Pa didn't leave me this land at all. He left me a piece of paper that says I own the rock. What I do with the rock is my concern." Franklin stared at him for a long moment. "You've changed," he said finally. "I've found something worth changing for." Franklin left. He did not ask what Caleb had found, because it did not occur to him that a crack in a limestone ridge could contain anything worth finding. This failure of imagination was not unique to Franklin. It was shared by nearly everyone in the settlement, and it would take an outsider, someone who dealt in wonders rather than bushels, to recognize what Caleb had discovered. That outsider arrived in April of 1849 in the person of Dr. Nathaniel Crane. Crane was a professor of natural science at Transylvania University in Lexington, a tall, angular man in his early 60s with white hair and the restless energy of someone who had spent a lifetime asking questions and had not yet run out. And he had come to the Cumberland region to study the karst topography, the limestone landscape of sinkholes, springs, and caves that characterize the geology of eastern Kentucky, and had heard, through the network of local contacts, that any good field scientist cultivated, about a man living inside a ridge. He arrived at Bone Ridge on a Tuesday afternoon in April, accompanied by a student assistant and a mule loaded with surveying equipment. Caleb met him at the crack. "Mr. Yancey," Crane said, peering at the fissure with the eager attention of a man who sees cracks in rock the way other men see doors. "I'm told you found a cave." "I've found several caves," Caleb said, "connected, behind this crack." "How large?" "The main chamber is roughly 80 by 100 feet, ceiling at 40. There are at least a dozen more chambers beyond it." Crane's eyebrows rose. "You've measured?" "As best I can, by pacing and estimation. I've been keeping records." "May I see?" "The records in the cave?" Caleb led him in. The passage through the crack was difficult for Crane, who was taller and broader than Caleb. But the professor negotiated it with a determination that bordered on obsession, emerging into the cathedral chamber with limestone dust on his coat and an expression of stunned reverence on his face. He spent 4 days in the cave. He measured the cathedral chamber with proper instruments, a surveyor's chain and a clinometer, and found it to be 92 feet long, 78 feet wide, and 44 feet from floor to ceiling at its highest point. He catalogued the formations with the systematic precision of a man who had spent 30 years classifying the Earth's wonders. He tested the water in the pool chamber and found it pure, fed by percolation through the limestone, naturally filtered, low in minerals, drinkable without treatment. He measured temperatures at 12 points throughout the system and confirmed Caleb's observations. The cave maintained a remarkably stable temperature between 55 and 58 degrees year-round. He also read Caleb's notebooks, all of them. He sat in the cathedral chamber by lantern light, turning pages with the careful attention of a man who recognizes quality when he sees it. And when he finished, he looked at Caleb with an expression that combined professional respect with something approaching astonishment. "These are excellent," Crane said. "Your formation descriptions are as precise as any I've seen from trained surveyors. Your hydrological observations are—" He paused, searching for the word. "They're rigorous. Where did you study?" "I didn't. I read Lyell and Silliman's journal." "You taught yourself geology from Lyell and Silliman?" "I taught myself to look. Lyell and Silliman taught me what I was looking at." Crane was quiet for a moment. The lantern light played across the flowstone curtain, turning it to amber. "Mr. Yancey, do you understand what you have here?" he said. "A cave. You have one of the most significant cave systems I've encountered in 20 years of karst research. The formations in the soda straw chamber alone are worth a scientific paper. The helictites are museum-quality specimens. And this room," he gestured at the cathedral. "This room is extraordinary. The scale, the preservation, the variety of formations. This is a site of genuine scientific importance." He paused again. "There's also the practical matter." "What practical matter?" "Tourism," Crane said. "Cave tourism is becoming a significant industry in Kentucky. Mammoth Cave has been receiving visitors for decades. There are operations at Diamond Cave, at Saltpeter Cave, at a dozen sites across the state. People will pay good money to see something like this. Caleb looked around the chamber that had been his home for 5 months. He had not thought of it as something other people might want to see. He had thought of it as his. "I don't want to damage the formations," he said. "Nor should you. The best operations are careful ones. Guided tours, controlled access, preservation as a priority. The cave's value increases the more intact it remains." Crane leaned forward. "I can help you. I can bring this to the attention of the scientific community. I can connect you with people who understand both the science and the business, but you'll need to improve the access. That crack won't serve for tourists." "I know," Caleb said. He had already been thinking about it. He spent the summer of 1849 building an entrance. The crack itself could not be significantly widened without risking structural damage to the ridge. The limestone above the fissure was load-bearing, and removing too much would invite collapse. But Caleb had identified, during his explorations, a second potential access point, a sinkhole on the ridgetop, roughly 30 feet east of the crack, that connected to the cathedral chamber through a vertical shaft. The shaft was natural, a chimney in the rock, roughly 4 feet in diameter, descending 25 feet to the chamber floor. It had been blocked at the surface by a plug of soil and debris that had accumulated over centuries, but the connection was real. Caleb could feel the draft rising through it when he cleared the first few feet of material. He dug out the shaft by hand, lowering himself on a rope and hauling the debris up in a bucket. It took 6 weeks. The work was dangerous. Loose rock fell from the shaft walls without warning, and twice Caleb narrowly avoided being struck by stones that would have killed him. He reinforced the shaft with a timber crib, a square frame of interlocking logs, stacked like a well casing, that held the walls stable and provided a structure for the ladder he would eventually install. The ladder itself was a piece of craftsmanship that surprised even Caleb. He built it from black locust, the hardest and most rot-resistant wood available in the Kentucky hills, with round rungs mortised into the side rails and secured with oak pegs. It descended the full 25 feet of the shaft and landed on the cathedral floor near the base of the great flowstone curtain. The climb was not easy, but it was possible for any able-bodied person, and it eliminated the crack as the primary access, opening the cave to visitors who would never have fit through 18 inches of limestone. Crane returned in September, bringing 2 colleagues from the university and a journalist from the Lexington Observer. They descended the ladder into the cathedral chamber, and the journalist, a man named Parkhill who had written about Mammoth Cave and considered himself difficult to impress, stood on the chamber floor and said, "Good God." He said nothing else for several minutes. He stood in the circle of lantern light and turned slowly, taking in the stalactites and stalagmites and the great flowstone curtain and the columns that rose from floor to ceiling like the pillars of a church built by geological forces that made human architecture look tentative by comparison. When he finally spoke again, he asked Caleb how long the formations had taken to grow. "Tens of thousands of years," Caleb said. "Perhaps 100,000 for the largest columns. A stalactite grows roughly 1 inch per century under ideal conditions." Parkhill looked up at a stalactite that was at least 6 feet long. 600 years, he said. At minimum, probably longer. The growth rate varies with water chemistry and temperature. And it's been here all this time, behind a crack in a rock. Behind a crack in a rock, Caleb confirmed. Parkhill's article, published in October 1849, described Yancey's Cathedral Cave in terms that were unusual for the period's typically restrained journalistic prose. The article brought letters, The letters brought visitors. The visitors brought money. Caleb charged 25 cents for a guided tour, 2 hours by lantern light, through the cathedral chamber, the pool room, and as far as the soda straw gallery. He limited groups to 6 people, need to protect the formations, and to ensure that each visitor could see properly by the light available. He was, by nature, a quiet guide, not theatrical, not given to the dramatic flourishes that made other cave operators popular. But his knowledge was deep and genuine, and his respect for the cave was evident in every word he spoke and every step he took, and visitors left with the sense that they had been shown something not just beautiful, but sacred. The income was modest at first, $5 or $6 a week during the touring season, but it was steady, and it was more money than Caleb had ever earned. He invested it carefully. He improved the ladder. He built a small cabin on the ridge top, near the shaft entrance, using lumber hauled up from the creek valley. He purchased better lanterns, whale oil lamps that burned brighter and longer than tallow. He bought supplies for the winter, salt pork, flour, coffee, dried apples. He continued to live in the cave. It was Crane who introduced him to Ada Marsh. Ada was 29, the daughter of a school teacher in Lexington, who had died the previous year, leaving her with a small inheritance, no family, and a passion for botanical illustration that was extraordinary in its precision and entirely unsupported by any institutional affiliation. She drew plants the way Caleb observed caves, with a meticulous, almost devotional attention to detail that transformed the ordinary into the remarkable. She had been illustrating specimens for Crane's department at Transylvania for 2 years, and when Crane mentioned that the cave contained unusual plant growth near the entrance, ferns and mosses that thrived in the constant humidity of the passage, Ada asked if she might visit to sketch them. She arrived in June of 1850. She was tall, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical knot, and hands that were stained with ink at the fingertips in a way that she did not bother to hide. She carried a portfolio of botanical illustrations, a set of drawing pencils, and a magnifying glass that she wore on a cord around her neck like a pendant. She was not interested in the cave's grandeur. She was interested in its edges, the transition zone where the underground world met the surface, where light faded and darkness began, where plants adapted to conditions that no garden could replicate. She spent hours at the cave entrance, on sketching the ferns that grew in the constant humidity of the crack's exhalation, maidenhair ferns, walking ferns, and a species of liverwort that she could not immediately identify and that turned out, upon later examination by Crane, to be previously undescribed. A new species, found at the entrance to a cave that no one had entered until 7 months ago. Caleb watched her work. He watched the way her pencil moved, quick and certain, laying down lines that captured not just the shape of a frond, but its character, the way it held the light, the way it curled at its tip, the way it related to the stone on which it grew. He watched the way she looked at things, with the same intensity he brought to cave formations, the same refusal to see something once and move on, the same conviction that the world revealed itself only to those who were willing to stay and look again. "You see things," he said to her on the second evening, as they sat outside the cabin watching the sunset paint the ridgeline. "Everyone sees things," Ada said. "Everyone looks. Not everyone sees." She turned to him. Her eyes were the color of the pool in the cave's second chamber, dark, clear, with a depth that invited study. "You sound like my father," she said. "He used to say that seeing was the hardest work there is, harder than digging, harder than building, because when you really see something, you have to accept what's there, not what you expected." "What did you expect here?" ferns. I found a new species, a cave, and a man who lives inside a mountain. I'd say reality exceeded expectations. They were married in September of 1850 in the settlement church, with Crane as a witness and the reverend who ran the lending library performing the ceremony. Franklin, Horace, and William were not invited. The congregation, such as it was, a dozen families from the surrounding hills, attended with the mixture of curiosity and goodwill that small communities bring to unlikely unions. The bride was a Lexington woman with ink-stained fingers. The groom was a man who lived in a hole in the ground. The general feeling was that they deserved each other, though whether this was meant as compliment or criticism depended on who was saying it. Ada moved into the cave, not the cabin above it, which she considered merely a convenient staging area, but the cave itself, the cathedral chamber where Caleb had been living for nearly 2 years. She brought her drawing supplies, her books, her magnifying glass, and an instinct for organization that transformed Caleb's bachelor arrangement of bedroll and scattered notebooks into a home of surprising comfort and order. She hung fabric across the alcove entrance to create a private sleeping chamber. She arranged the cooking area with the efficiency of a woman who had kept house for her father for 10 years after her mother's death. She installed a system of hooks and shelves for drying herbs and storing dried food that used the natural irregularities of the cave walls so cleverly that visitors later assumed they had been carved for the purpose. Their partnership was immediate and complete. Ada handled the correspondence with Crane and other scientists, writing letters in a clear, formal hand that lent an air of institutional authority to what was, in reality, a 2-person operation in a cave. She managed the growing file of visitors' names and addresses, creating a mailing list that would eventually reach 300 entries. She kept accounts, meticulous records of income and expenses that allowed them to plan and invest with a precision that Caleb, left to his own devices, would never have achieved. And she drew. Over the following years, Ada produced a series of illustrations of Yancey's Cathedral Cave that would eventually be recognized as masterworks of scientific illustration. Precise, luminous renderings of the flowstone curtain, the soda straw gallery, the helictite clusters, and the great columns of the cathedral chamber, each one capturing not just the form of the formations but the play of lantern light on stone, the sense of depth and scale and silent age that made the cave what it was. She worked in graphite and watercolor, spending hours on a single formation, adjusting her lantern position again and again to capture the exact quality of light and shadow that revealed the stone's character. The drawings were not merely beautiful, they were precise, accurate enough that geologists could identify mineral types and formation processes from the illustrations alone, a quality that made them invaluable to scientists who could not visit the cave in person. The years accumulated like the calcite that had built the formations, slowly, steadily, each one adding a thin layer to the structure of their life. The cave business grew. By 1855, then Caleb was guiding 200 visitors a year, and the income, supplemented by the sale of Ada's illustrations to scientific publications and private collectors, allowed them to live comfortably. They expanded the cabin. They improved the shaft entrance with a proper stone collar and a roofed shelter to protect the ladder from weather. They hired a young man from the settlement to help with the tours during the busy season and to manage the growing correspondence from scientists and tourists who wanted to visit. Their first child, a son named Solomon, after Caleb's father, was born in November of 1851, 3 years to the month after Caleb had first crawled through the crack. The boy's first breaths were of cave air, 56 degrees and clean, and his first sight, when his eyes could focus, was the lantern light on the flowstone curtain, which must have looked to an infant's blurred vision like a wall of warm gold. A daughter, Lydia, followed in 1853. She was named for no one in particular. Ada chose the name because she liked its sound, and Caleb agreed because he had learned that agreeing with Ada on aesthetic matters was both wise and pleasant. The children grew up between two worlds: the ridgetop, with its wind and weather and cedar-scented air, and the cave below, with its silence and constancy and formations that served as the most extraordinary playground any children had ever known. Solomon was cautious and analytical, inheriting his father's patience and his mother's eye for detail. By the age of 10, he could identify every formation type in the cave and explain, in the language he'd absorbed from Crane's visits, the processes by which each had formed. Lydia was adventurous and physical, drawn to the cave's unexplored margins, the tight passages Caleb hadn't mapped, the pools he hadn't tested, the dark corners where the lantern light didn't quite reach. She was the one who discovered the cave's 7th and largest chamber, at the age of 12, by crawling through a passage Caleb had dismissed as a dead end and finding, on the other side, a room that was nearly as large as the cathedral itself. The Civil War came, and unlike the weather above the ridge, it did not pass quickly. Kentucky's divided loyalties brought skirmishes to the Cumberland Gap, and soldiers of both sides passed through the valley below. In the autumn of 1862, a Confederate foraging party climbed partway up the ridge, drawn by the smoke from Caleb's cabin chimney, and demanded food. And Caleb gave them what he had: a sack of cornmeal, some dried venison, a jar of honey Ada had collected from wild bees. The soldiers were young, thin, and tired, and they took the food without violence and left without discovering the cave entrance, which was hidden by the shelter Caleb had built over the shaft. Ada, who had watched from the cabin window with Solomon on her hip and Lydia hiding behind her skirts, said afterward, "We should keep less food in the cabin and more in the cave. What they can't find, they can't take." It was a practical observation, and Caleb followed it. They moved their stores underground. A cave at 56 degrees was, in any case, a better larder than a cabin that froze in winter and sweltered in summer. The practice saved them in the winter of 1864, when a larger detachment of irregulars passed through the valley and stripped every farm they found. The Yancey cabin, appearing nearly empty, was searched and dismissed. Below the ridge, in the cathedral chamber, 200 pounds of preserved food sat untouched in the natural cool of the stone. Caleb continued to guide tours for whoever arrived: federal officers on leave, Confederate sympathizers seeking distraction, and the occasional deserter who wanted nothing more than to stand in a beautiful room and forget, for an hour, that the world above was tearing itself apart. He charged no toll during the war years. It seemed wrong, somehow, to profit from beauty while young men were dying in fields not 50 miles away. The cave, during those years, became something close to a sanctuary, a place outside the conflict, outside time, where the only war was the slow, patient war of water against stone, and the only casualties were the millennia it took for a stalactite to grow another inch. Franklin died in 1867 of a heart that gave out while he was plowing a field he had plowed every spring for 30 years. He had worked the bottomland hard, the way he worked everything, with force rather than understanding, with demand rather than partnership. The soil gave back less each year, and Franklin gave more, and the exchange was never equal. His portion of the family land, the farmhouse, the bottomland, passed to his sons, who managed it with diminishing returns until the land was sold to pay debts in the 1880s. Horace died in 1871 when a log broke free at the sawmill and struck him across the chest. He had been a strong man, stronger than any of his brothers, and the irony of his death, killed by the very timber that was his livelihood, was not lost on the community. His timber rights were sold to a company from Lexington that clear-cut the south slope in 2 years and left behind a landscape of stumps and erosion that would take a generation to recover. William, the quiet brother, came to the cave once, in the autumn of 1869, 2 years after Franklin's death. He descended the ladder into the cathedral chamber and stood there for a long time without speaking. Caleb stood beside him, holding a lantern, waiting. "Pa knew," William said at last. "Knew what?" "That there was something here. That's why he gave it to you. Not as a joke, as a gift. He knew you were the one who'd look." Caleb considered this, and he had spent 20 years believing his father had given him the worthless parcel out of indifference or dismissal. The possibility that it had been deliberate, that his father had seen in Caleb the curiosity that the ridge would reward, changed nothing about the past, but it changed the way Caleb held the past, which was enough. "Thank you," he said. William nodded. He climbed the ladder and went home. Caleb Yancey lived to be 78 years old. In his later years, he became something that no one in the settlement would have predicted for the runt of Solomon Yancey's sons, a respected figure. Not famous, Yancey's Cathedral Cave never achieved the national reputation of Mammoth Cave or Luray Caverns, but known in the way that a man of genuine knowledge and quiet integrity becomes known in a region, through word of mouth and accumulated respect. Geologists from half a dozen universities corresponded with him. The State Geological Survey cited his observations. A professor from Yale, visiting in 1878, spent a week in the cave and declared Caleb's formation taxonomy more accurate than most published surveys I have reviewed. He spent less time guiding tours. Solomon took over that work in the early 1880s, proving to be a more articulate guide than his father, if a less intuitive one, and more time in the deeper chambers of the cave, sitting with a lantern and his notebook, recording observations with the same care he had brought to his very first entry in 1848. The cave had not changed. The formations had not visibly grown in the 30-plus years he had been observing them. A reminder, if he needed one, that the timescales of geology dwarfed the timescales of human life in a way that was humbling rather than diminishing. He thought about time often in those years. Sitting in the cathedral chamber, surrounded by formations that had been growing for 100,000 years, he understood that his 40 years of residence were, in the cave's terms, less than a blink. The stalactites had not noticed his arrival. They would not notice his departure. The drip in the pool chamber would continue to fall, adding its infinitesimal deposit of calcite to the Rimstone Dam long after every Yancey was forgotten. This understanding did not make him feel small. It made him feel held, cradled in something so much larger and so much more patient than himself that his anxieties and ambitions and griefs became, if not insignificant, then at least proportional. Ada continued to draw. Her illustrations of the cave, accumulated over decades, filled 12 portfolios and represented the most complete visual record of any American cave system produced in the 19th century. In 1882, a selection of her drawings was exhibited at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and a critic for the Tribune praised them for their exceptional quality and scientific accuracy. Ada read the review and said, "He should see the cave." She died in March of 1888 of pneumonia in the cathedral chamber where they had lived for 38 years. The formations above her, the stalactites and columns and the great flowstone curtain, had witnessed her arrival as a young woman with ink-stained fingers and a magnifying glass, and they witnessed her departure with the same ancient, patient indifference with which they witnessed everything. Caleb sat beside her as the lantern burned low and held her hand, which was still stained with ink. The drip in the pool chamber kept its rhythm. Somewhere in the deeper passages, air moved through stone with a sound like slow breathing. He buried her on the ridge top, in a spot where the morning sun fell first and where, in spring, the maidenhair ferns she had come to study grew in such profusion that the rocky ground looked softened, almost gentle. He carved her name into a slab of the ridge's own limestone and set it at the head of the grave, and beneath her name, he carved the words she had said to him on their second evening together. Reality exceeded expectations. He lived for one more year. He spent it in the cave mostly, in sitting in the cathedral chamber in the amber light of the flowstone curtain, writing his final observations. He wrote about the cave's constancy, the same temperature, the same formations, the same slow drip in the pool chamber that had been falling, he calculated, for at least 50,000 years and would fall for 50,000 more. He wrote about what it meant to live inside the earth, to be sheltered by stone, to measure your life against a time scale that made your life invisible. He wrote about the crack in the rock that had been too narrow for his brothers, too dark for his neighbors, too strange for his father, and just wide enough for a man who was willing to turn sideways and push through. He died on the 6th of January, 1889, in the cathedral chamber, with a lantern burning and his notebook open and the cave breathing around him in its slow, eternal rhythm. Solomon found him in the morning. He recorded the temperature, 56 degrees. He closed his father's notebook and placed it on the shelf with the others, 39 notebooks in all, spanning 40 years of observation. He climbed the ladder into the January cold and stood on the ridge top and looked at the mountains, which were white with snow and very still. The cave continued. Yancey's cathedral cave remained in the family for 3 generations. Solomon operated it until 1912, expanding the tour route to include the chamber that Lydia had discovered as a girl, which he named the Lydia Gallery in her honor. His son, Caleb II, operated it until 1938, or adding electric lighting in 1929, a modernization that his grandfather would have found both practical and faintly regrettable, since the formations looked different under electric light than they did under lantern flame, and the difference was not entirely an improvement. The notebooks were donated to Transylvania University in 1940, where they became a foundational resource for the study of Kentucky karst geology. Ada's illustrations were acquired by the Smithsonian in 1955, and a selection of them remains on permanent display in the geology wing. The cave was designated a National Natural Landmark in 1972. The flowstone curtain is still intact. The soda straws still hang in their crystalline forest. The pool still holds its clear, still water, fed by a drip that has not stopped since before humans walked the continent. Modern geologists, using instruments that Caleb Yancey could not have imagined, have confirmed and extended his observations. The cave maintains a temperature between 55 and 58 degrees year-round, exactly as he recorded. The formations are calcite, aragonite, and gypsum, exactly as he identified them. The hydrology follows the path he traced. His notebooks, a geologist at the University of Kentucky wrote in 2004, represent one of the most detailed and accurate amateur cave surveys of the 19th century, remarkable not only for their precision, but for the evident affection with which their author regarded his subject. The crack in the east face of Bone Ridge is still there. It is still 18 inches wide. Caleb's careful widening to 20 inches has been worn back by a century and a half of weather. It still breathes. On cold days, you can see the exhalation, a faint plume of warm air rising from the rock like the breath of something sleeping. Most people walk past it. It is too narrow, too dark, too much like a mouth. But the cathedral is still there, on the other side, 40 feet in and a world away, waiting, as it has always waited, for someone willing to turn sideways and see what the darkness holds. The earth keeps its wonders in tight places. It always has. The question was never what lay beyond the crack. The question was who would be narrow enough and brave enough to find out.